All right, so tonight, we're going to end with a video tonight, but we're going to start tonight with, we got everybody? Okay. This is lesson 28. We actually only have 2 more to go, and it's from Matthew chapter 26, the last half, and the beginning of chapter 27. It's called Trials and Verdicts. Now, for those of you that are a little bit older, you remember back in 1999, the Columbine school shootings. It was one of the first instances of like a mass shooting in a public facility. Well, the first victim, her name was Rachel Joy Scott. If you recall the incident, you'll remember she was very open about her faith, and when the shooters came in and they had confronted her, I think she was in the library or something, they said, "Do you believe in Jesus?" And she said, "Yes, I do." He shot her, he killed her. She stood up for Jesus. She wasn't just an ordinary teenager. In many ways, her kindness came through. She had kindness, love, passion. She loved the Lord, and she didn't have any problem admitting that to other people. She inspired a lot of people, not only prior to this, but in the aftermath of this. She was often characterized as a compassionate young woman who reached out to the struggling students, the new students, the special needs students. And she was never hesitant to declare her faith and share her faith. There was even a movie made in 2016, and it was called I'm Not Ashamed. And it was a movie that just sort of journaled her faith, and it showed how she was not ashamed to stand up for Jesus. But I guess my question is, are you? When we look at this lesson today, there's numerous horrific incidences in Jesus' Jewish and Roman trials. While even those close to him, they don't stand up for him, even his disciples. He stands alone. But I want to look at this. It's almost like in this chapter in Matthew, it's almost like Matthew is a playwright. And some of these scenes and these acts, they occur like simultaneously. So we're going to treat it like a play, and we're going to call it Act 1, 2, and 3. But besides that, I want you to keep in mind that ultimately, Matthew is writing this story down, but God is the director. He is the director of each and every one. So the central idea is going to be Jesus is our perfect example for trusting in a sin-filled world. And the question being, will you follow Jesus' example and trust God even if you're mistreated? So let's look at those 3 sections then. All right, if you look at the first one, you'll notice that letter F reoccurring. Falsely accused Jesus. That's going to be the Sanhedrin. And that's chapter 26, and that's verses 57 to 68. And then the second part is flagrantly denied Jesus, and that's verses 69 to 27:10, and that's the disciples. And then finally, forgotten and rejected Jesus, and that's chapter 27, verses 11 to 31. And that's the people. Now let's look at the first section. As I said, we're going to call it Act 1. We see the excruciating torment that our King walked through physically, emotionally, spiritually, mentally on his road to defeating death. Let's take a very close look at each of these details. Jesus basically suffered through 6 trials in the space of 1 night. By way of background, there is a Jewish trial, and that's going to be the first 3 trials, and that's in the religious court. And then there's going to be a Roman trial in the civil court, and that's going to be the last 3 phases. Each phase involves a preliminary hearing, a formal arraignment, and then a formal sentencing. So let's go to the first one, the Jewish trial. Jesus is initially tried before Annas. Annas is the former high priest. He's also the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who's now the high priest. So they're going to go first to Annas and then Caiaphas, and then Jesus is going to go in front of the Sanhedrin, which is sort of like the Supreme Court, of Israel. So he's going to be charged with blasphemy, claiming to be the Son of God, the Messiah. These trials before the Jewish authorities, they sort of reflect the degree to which the Jewish leaders they just disregard all rules because they're just in a place where they hate Jesus. They'll use anything to accuse him. They want to disguise all of these things under the darkness of night. And even their intents are very negative, and we can see it. And we're going to start off with Annas. All right, first of all, he's going to actually be the person that puts all of this in motion. He has some past grudges with Jesus, and it's almost as though whenever Jesus meets in this preliminary hearing with Annas, he's kind of like wasting time. He's kind of trying to leave the Sanhedrin time to get organized, to gather together and have a quorum, and they're going to be at Caiaphas' house. So then Jesus is bound. He's sent across the courtyard from Annas' house to Caiaphas', and Caiaphas is going to preside over this arraignment stage. Now, we're going to quickly see in this trial, there's a whole lot of anomalies and a whole lot of things. If you were an attorney, you would see that they could be thrown out with appeals. Actually, there's 8 of them to speak of. First of all, they met at Caiaphas' house. They were supposed to meet in the temple. Secondly, no trial could be held during Passover. Well, this was definitely the feast, the time of the feast. And the third one was each member of the court was supposed to vote privately. Well, in this court, they just all say yes at the same time. If the death penalty was administered, they had to wait a whole day before it was carried out. This was only a matter of hours. No trial could be held at night. This one was held at night. The accused, which was Jesus, had to have representation. He stood alone. Self-incriminating questions couldn't be asked. That's all they asked him. And probably the worst flaw of all, they solicited 2 false witnesses that told their stories simultaneously. It's customary for witnesses to be privately questioned so that they don't influence each other's testimony. But that's not what happened here. Jesus' answers were misconstrued. He didn't say he would destroy the temple and raise it in 3 days. He said that the temple would be destroyed and it would be built up in 3 days. And nobody, even the disciples, realized at this time that he was talking about the resurrection. So anyway, after a monstrously illegal midnight trial, Jesus is found guilty of blasphemy by the religious leaders, which it's not punishable by death, but they kind of have a plan here. They realize that they don't have the power to execute Jesus, but if they can just hold him over and then send him to the Roman court, Pilate is sort of a cruel, corrupt individual, and they're probably not going to have a very hard time getting a death sentence out of him. So while they still have the opportunity, they decide they're going to brutally beat him, which they do, and then they're going to send him over to Pilate. But in the meantime, I want to switch to something that's going to be happening at the same time. But let's look at an experience first. How does it feel to be wronged, taken advantage of, not getting what you deserve? Well, I want to go back to an author, Brian Stevenson. He was a friend of the late theologian Tim Keller, which you probably have heard him before. They loved to banter back and forth about their faith in the justice system. Stevenson won much acclaim and criticism for a book he wrote in 2014. It was called Just Mercy. It was about the redeeming potential of mercy. In this, it's a nonfiction, first of all. The whole book is a true story. Brian Stevenson is an attorney, and he founded the Equal Justice Initiative. In that Equal Justice Initiative, they had decided that what they were going to be set up to do was they were going to defend the poor, the minorities, and people that have become wrongly condemned and trapped in our courts and in the criminal justice system today. It's hard to fathom that some of these things that were going on still surface in courtrooms today. And the one story that was most interesting in this, it was about a 13-year-old boy. Little 13-year-old black boy was working in the fields one day, and he's working alongside of this little white girl. And on this particular day, she is brutally raped and murdered. Now, there are a lot of field, workers out there. There's eyewitnesses, and They've seen what happened, but for some reason, this little boy is accused of this crime. He is railroaded through our justice system, found guilty of first-degree murder, and sentenced to the death penalty. All of the appeals fell on deaf ears. He was actually sentenced to the electric chair. On the day of his execution, this little boy was so little, he wasn't tall enough to fit his arms into the straps on the electric chair. He sat on his Bible. This story happened. This story probably happened in most of our lifetimes. Nobody stood up for this little boy, just like nobody is standing up for Jesus in these trials. Do we follow Jesus and stand up for what's right, even when nobody else does? Let's look at the second part. The second part is flagrantly deny Jesus. Before Matthew goes back to the events about Pilate, we're going to see a second act. This second act is occurring at the same time as Jesus' Jewish trial. It focuses on two of the disciples, Judas and Peter, and their offenses of betrayal and denial. The two men are supposed to be devoted followers of Jesus, but they failed him. Both men responded very differently, although, to their sin and had a hugely different outcome. Let's just suffice it to say with Judas, he was a greedy, corrupt individual who really didn't feel probably much more than remorse whenever he threw the coins back. He certainly didn't feel repentance. But I do want to look more closely at Peter. Peter denies Jesus 3 times. At the exact same time, this is in the courtyard right out of Caiaphas' house, at the exact same time that the Sanhedrin are questioning Jesus. The only thing is, Peter doesn't stand up nearly as well to the criticism and the scrutiny as Jesus does. Almost immediately after being admitted into that courtyard, he starts being questioned about knowing Jesus. When the first servant girl comes up to him, he almost kind of ignores her, but he denies Jesus just sort of silently. Then he kind of moves off to the side a little bit. When he's asked for a second time, he still denies Jesus. He's trying to make his way out of the courtyard, although he tries to ignore these girls. It's almost like he can't break free of these escalating questions. But by the time that third question came, he actually curses. He vehemently denies Jesus. Oftentimes, we don't stand up for our faith either. We just keep digging the hole deeper like Peter did. As soon as that last denial leaves his lips, the rooster crows. Peter knows what's happened. He has betrayed his master. He immediately repents. He was certainly wrong and sinful, but it wasn't an act of cold-heartedness. He actually had a heart for Jesus. The problem was, it was an act of cowardice. He was fearful of the consequences. Jesus had told the disciples what was going to happen. Whenever he was crucified and whenever he was arrested, what would happen to them? We've all seen similar instances in our own lives, probably with our own kids, if I think about it. My kids, I guess they're not unlike anybody else's. They would lie to avoid the consequences. I remember one time on senior skip day, as the kids called it, my son and his friends decided not to appear at school. Of course, teaching in the same district, the building principal calls me and says, your son's not in school today. And I'm going, oh, really? So when he gets home from school that evening, we question him. Why was he not there? Well, in typical teenager mode, he lies. But unfortunately for him, he had this bright red sunburn on his face, his neck, his back. So when we inquired about the sunburn, he had gym class. He had gym class early in the morning for about a half an hour, and he got this sunburn. Well, he quickly realized that he was caught after his couple denials. He wasn't trying to be corrupt. He wasn't being malicious. He'd made a bad error in judgment. He was definitely wrong, although. He was guilty and kept digging the hole deeper, just like Peter did. My son knew he was supposed to stand up for peer pressure, and he should have been in school that day. But how many times as adults do we do the same thing? Do we stand up for Jesus when things get tough, or do we fail him because of the consequences? Now let's think about the third one, forgotten and rejected, and that's in chapter 27. We're now on the third act. Jesus is badly beaten. He's standing before the Roman authorities. The Jewish leaders demand that Pilate agree to their death sentence. They've even drummed up some more false charges. They say he's inciting people to riot, or he's forbidding people from paying their taxes, and he's claiming to be a king. Initially, Pilate could find no reason to kill Jesus, so he sent him to Herod for the second phase in this trial. Herod just ridiculed Jesus. He didn't want to face the political reprise either, so he sends him back to Pilate. Now we witness the final trial. Something's going to happen. Pilate tries to appease the Jews by having Jesus flogged and scourged. Well, even this is a major deal because the Roman flogging involved the victim being stripped of his garments and stretched across a pillar. And then they would have bits of iron woven into the leather and bone so that whenever the strap hit the body, it not only ripped off skin, but it ripped veins and arteries. Sometimes people even died from this. In reality, Pilate was just trying to avoid sentencing Jesus to the death sentence. He was even listening to his wife in his ear, telling him about the harm, to not bring any harm to Jesus, that she had this dream and she was, that she really felt like he shouldn't do this. But unlike the Galilean pilgrims and the disciple crowds that were yelling, "Hosanna, Hosanna," 9 hours earlier, we now have the Jewish priestly clique who has followed Jesus into this Roman trial, yelling, "Crucify him, crucify him." Peter tried to persuade them to take Barabbas, the Roman insurrectionist, the real criminal, but they weren't having any of it. Consequently, he finally caved to public scrutiny. Pilate washed his hands of the whole thing and turned Jesus over to his tormentors. This all happened in 6 hours. 6 trials in 6 hours. When you think about it, that number 6 often reflects imperfection in the Bible. Mankind is not perfect. Now, by way of closing this up, oftentimes when you go to a play and you see Act 1, 2, and 3, it's kind of sometimes followed by what's called an epilogue. An epilogue is usually to shed some remarks, some deeper thoughts, a more inherent meaning on what's actually going on here. These 3 acts aren't the full story. Let's take a closer look at the bigger picture. As sad as this story is, it's one of the greatest acts of divine justice ever carried out. It's done in full accord with the determined purpose and foreknowledge of God and for his highest purposes. Jesus' death secured salvation for you and me. It opened the way for God to forgive sin without compromising his holy standard. Yes, Jesus suffered tragically, but necessarily. The truth is, Jesus' death was all part of God's plan. As I alluded to in the beginning, God is the director. He writes this story. He staged this whole scenario of events. As a result of sin, we desperately needed a solution. We needed a Savior. God allowed Jesus to endure these excruciating trials and verdicts so that he could provide the perfect lamb to save us. Jesus didn't get what he deserved. That little boy didn't get what he deserved. Rachel Joy Scott didn't get what she deserved. We don't get what we deserve either when we get mercy. We are getting more than what we deserve. Jesus is the perfect example. He's the perfect lamb. He's that amazing gift. Do we follow Jesus, his example? Do we trust God, even when we're mistreated? I want to follow this up with a real quick 3.5-minute video. It's called "It's Friday, but Sunday is Coming." And it's pretty much what we're just talking about in this whole lesson, and it's going to kind of lead into what Matt will be talking about next week. So let's look at this real quick.